Between 1865 and 1866, the young republics of Peru, Chile, Bolivia, and Ecuador joined forces to face the threat of a possible Spanish reconquest. After fierce clashes, they managed to definitively repel the enemy fleet. The Spanish-South American War seemed to have come to an end. However, a new problem emerged almost immediately: border disputes. During the Viceroyalty, the Spanish crown, it never bothered to draw precise boundaries between its jurisdictions, leaving a void that would soon confront the new nations. One of the greatest tensions arose along the Chile-Bolivia border. Both countries claimed different boundaries within the vast region of the Atacama Desert. For Chile, the border reached up to the 23rd parallel, while for Bolivia it was up to the 26th. It was an important strip since it contained valuable deposits of guano and, above all, saltpeter, a mineral coveted for its value as a fertilizer and as a component of gunpowder. In a first attempt to resolve this conflict, both nations signed the Boundary Treaty of 1866, setting the border at the 24th parallel and establishing a shared exploitation zone. However, over time, economic control ended up in Chilean hands, especially due to the power gained by the Antofagasta Nitrate and Railway Company. Bolivia watched this with growing suspicion. The treaty of mutual benefit, but that was not the case in practice. So, seeking to regain some control and income, the Bolivian government began to demand tax payments from Chilean companies, which quickly refused to comply with these new regulations. With the threat of war, Bolivia turned to Peru for support, and on February 6, 1873, they signed the secret Treaty of Defensive Alliance. The pact guaranteed mutual military support in the event of war and prevented Bolivia from forming an alliance with Chile. Peru also felt threatened by the advance of Chilean companies. Their production of saltpeter had considerably lower costs, which allowed them to compete advantageously in international markets, especially in Europe. This led to a drop in demand for Peruvian saltpeter, whose industry, on the other hand, had been nationalized. State inefficiency, worsened by corruption, bureaucracy, and weak logistics, made it impossible to compete with the Chilean business model. Peru also feared Bolivia might be taken over by Chile, which could trade Antofagasta for Tacna and Arica. Therefore, Peru signed the agreement. A year later, tensions eased after Chile and Bolivia signed a second boundary treaty in 1874. This new agreement recognized Bolivia's right to collect taxes from Chilean companies, but it included a clause. Those taxes could not be increased for a period of 25 years. The conflict appeared settled until 1876, when General Hilarion Deza seized power in Bolivia through a coup d'etat. His dictatorship was soon cornered by a deep economic crisis. Looking for a way out, Daza set his sights on Antofagasta, where the nitrate boom was generating substantial profits. So in 1878, he published it. A new tax of 10 cents on Chilean companies for every quintal of nitrate exported. This measure openly violated the existing treaty. The affected company refused to pay and requested support from its government. The Chilean response was immediate. They rejected the tax, filed a diplomatic complaint, and thus supported the company's refusal. The spark of the conflict had been reignited. In response, on February 1, 1879, the government, Bolivia seized Salitrera Company's assets. Chile ordered Colonel Emilio Sotomayor to land at Antofagasta to stop the asset auction. The Chilean troops took control of the city without resistance. Bolivia, aware of its limited military capacity, decided to withdraw. The news quickly reached Lima. The Peruvian president, Mariano Ignacio Prado, opted for diplomatic intervention. He tasked José Antonio de la Valle with traveling to Chile to propose suspending hostilities and appointing an arbitrating country, as outlined in the treaty. In this way, Bolivian tax measures would be frozen until the conflict was resolved through the appropriate channels. However, the diplomatic mission failed from the start. Upon arriving in Valparaiso, Lavalle was received with hostility. Chilean President Aníbal Pinto had been informed of the secret defensive alliance treaty between Bolivia and Peru, mediating the conflict while having a secret pact with the enemy was inconceivable to Chile. This deepened the tensions. In any case, Bolivia also did not intend to negotiate a peaceful solution. On March 1, 1879, it formally declared a state of war against Chile, expelled Chilean citizens from its territory, and confiscated all their property. Chile did not take long to respond. On March 21, it occupied the ports of Cobija and Tocopilla, and 2 days later, on March 23, the battle was fought. The Battle of Calama, where a group of 135 Bolivians, led by Eduardo Avaroa, faced 550 Chilean soldiers who were better armed and trained. Military superiority prevailed, marking the first land battle of the War of the Pacific. That afternoon, Chile consolidated its control over the Bolivian coast, and Bolivia permanently lost its sovereign access to the sea. After the first battle, Chile demanded Peru remain neutral, but the Peruvian government responded by requesting more time, claiming it needed to consult Congress before taking an official stance. This delay was interpreted by Chile as a stalling tactic, a trick to buy time and prepare an offensive. Faced with that suspicion, on April 5, 1879, Chile formally declared war on Peru. That same day, under the command of Rear Admiral Williams Rebolledo, the Chilean fleet set sail for the port of Iquique and blockaded it. The War of the Pacific had begun, and it did so leaving three major certainties. The first was that the outcome of the conflict would be decided at sea. Second, Chile was better prepared, equipped, and organized on the naval front. And the third was that Bolivia had very little to offer militarily, being able to provide only logistical support and some resources. Despite the alliance, the conditions were notoriously unequal. Chile had a modern and powerful fleet, equipped with two newly acquired armored ships, the twin ships Cochrane and Blanco Encalada. Meanwhile, Peru also had two armored ships, the frigate Independencia and the monitor Huáscar. But both were 11 years older and less armed than their counterparts. In terms of corvettes, gunboats, transport ships, and overall tonnage, the Chilean advantage was clear. Given this scenario, a direct naval clash was unfeasible for Peru. The only possible strategy was to wear down the enemy by attacking their supply lines and avoiding direct confrontations. Chile stayed put, watching and expecting Peru to reclaim Iquique, but Peru also didn't attack. So Chile decided to take the initiative and launch a surprise naval offensive against the port of Callao, Peru's main port. They sent two armored ships north, leaving the blockade of Iquique in the hands of the young officer, Captain Arturo Prat, commanding the veteran corvette Esmeralda. Coincidentally, on the same May 16th that the Chilean fleet set sail for Icallao, the Peruvian forces also set out. President Mariano Ignacio Prado took the fleet to Arica to reinforce the southern defense and prevent a possible Chilean land advance. During the voyage, both naval forces crossed paths on the high seas, but they never saw each other. Peru was sailing close to its coast, while Chile was sailing offshore to avoid being detected. When they arrived in Arica, a crucial piece of news awaited them. Iquique had been left unprotected. It was the perfect time to take it back. Captain Miguel Grau, commander of the monitor Huáscar, would lead the attack. At 7 in the morning on May 21, 1879, the Battle of Iquique began. The Chilean corvettes, caught by surprise, fired immediately, but their shots hit the Peruvian monitor's armor without causing damage. To their advantage, the Huáscar began the pursuit of the corvette Esmeralda, while the frigate Independencia separated to chase the gunboat, Covadonga, attempting to flee south. The Huáscar trapped the Esmeralda in Iquique's port. Miguel Grau, mindful of how close they were to land, decided to act cautiously. A miscalculation in his shots could endanger the Peruvian port and civilians. He soon noticed that his gunners did not have the necessary skill or aim. Then he realized that the strategy had to be different. Ram the Chilean ship, destroy it with his ram. He did just that. The Huáscar charged and pierced Esmeralda's hull, causing severe damage. At the same time, its cannons opened fire, wiping out part of the Chilean crew. Arturo Prat instinctively shouted a war cry and leaped onto the Huáscar with a few men following. He knew he was doomed, but maybe he would have one last chance. He moved quickly across the enemy deck toward the command tower where Miguel Grau was. He advanced as far as he could until he was brought down by a precise shot. At the moment Arturo Prat fell, Miguel Grau ordered a ceasefire and began to retreat. He demanded Esmeralda's surrender, but after Prat's death, First Lieutenant Luis Uribe and his officers chose to fight on. They nailed their flags to the mast and endured 2 more attacks. After the 3rd impact, the corvette sank in the waters of Iquique, leaving only 61 survivors, about a third of its original crew. In an act of nobility, Miguel Grau ordered the lowering of the lifeboats to rescue the Chilean castaways. He gave them medical care and treated them with dignity, but his most memorable act came later. He sent a letter of condolence to the widow of Arturo Prat, in which he highlighted his bravery, honor, and sacrifice. Along with the letter, he returned his sword, his wedding ring, and 3 personal photographs. These acts of humanity and respect transcended the conflict. Since then, Miguel Grau has been known as the Gentleman of the Seas, both in Peru and in Chile, where to this day, every May 21st, the heroism of Arturo Prat is commemorated with a national holiday. After the rescue, Huáscar sailed south to join Independencia, which was still pursuing the gunboat Covadonga. The artillery fire. It was during that maneuver that a tragic event occurred. The commanding captain, Juan Guillermo More, did not notice a huge submerged rock near the coast and crashed his ship against it. The Peruvian ship began to sink rapidly. The Covadonga, seeing what occurred, tried to attack, but Huáscar withdrew upon noticing the approach. Miguel Grau decided not to pursue her and focused on rescuing the survivors from the Independencia. That was how, in an unfortunate turn, Peru lost its most powerful armored ship, the best weapon it had to face an unequal war. Although they sank the Esmeralda and recaptured Iquique, losing the Independencia was a devastating setback. The Huáscar was left alone defending the Navy. The next day, on May 22, the Chilean ships arrived at the port of Callao, but the Peruvian vessels were no longer there. The raid was useless. They had to return. Miguel Grau, wanting to save time and avoid going ashore, left Iquique on May 24 and bombarded Antofagasta on the 26th. With their armored ships absent, the Chilean lines were vulnerable, and it was the perfect time to exploit this. The attack was accurate. They destroyed cannons, water condensing machines, but most importantly, the telegraph cable that connected Antofagasta with the rest of Chile, leaving the city cut off. During the journey, the Huáscar evaded enemy attacks, sank 3 sailing ships, captured 3 others for the Peruvian squadron, and destroyed 7 boats. During these operations, Miguel Grau again showed his character. He refused to destroy a water condensing machine to prevent the population from dying of thirst. And he agreed to the request of a merchant who asked him not to bombard the port of Cobija, which was vital for local trade, once again showing his humanity in times of war. On June 7th, the Huáscar returned to Callao for repairs and reinforcement. And a month later, he returned to the sea to undertake new raids to the south, achieving significant results. One of the most significant was the capture of the transport ship Rimac, which was carrying 260 carabineros, 215 horses' weapons, and coal. The loss was so severe that it led to the resignation of the Chilean Rear Admiral Juan William Reboledo and the ministerial cabinet. In July and August, Chile's situation worsened. 3 of its ships were sunk, 7 were captured and incorporated into the Peruvian fleet, and more than 60 boats were destroyed. 5 months after the war began, the Monitor, Huáscar, had become a floating wall, an insurmountable obstacle that prevented any Chilean attempt to advance into Peruvian territory. One thing was clear to Chile: the Huáscar had to be destroyed. That mission was entrusted to Captain Galvarino Riveros, who began to plan the ambush carefully. He would create 2 attack groups, each led by the armored ships Cochrane and Blanco Encalada with 2 corvette escorts, solely to take down the Huáscar. Completely unaware of this, President Mariano Ignacio Prado ordered Miguel Grau to make one last reconnaissance expedition off the enemy coast. Then he would attend to the persistent request to repair the Huáscar. The ship urgently needed it. It had damage to the engine, armor, and hull. Its wear and tear was obvious. Even so, in the early morning of October 8, he took Antofagasta, accompanied by the corvette Union, looking to detect enemy presence. But they did not spot any, so they began the return to Iquique. It was then that they spotted 3 ships approaching. It was the Blanco Encalada, along with 2 corvettes. The Huáscar and the Union turned south, trying to escape. For a moment they thought they had lost them, so they turned around and headed north, toward Peruvian territory. But near Punta Angamos, another group of 3 ships emerged from another direction. The Cochrane was flanked by 2 corvettes. Miguel Grau had fallen into the ambush. He tried to increase speed, but it was already too late. The Chilean armored ships had him surrounded. Miguel Grau communicated with Aurelio Garcia, captain of the Union, and ordered him to flee. Peru could not afford to lose its 2 best ships. He, on the other hand, decided to stay and fight. He tried to take the initiative, opened fire on the Cochrane from more than a kilometer away. His shots were accurate. He moved closer and fired a volley of projectiles, one striking the Huáscar's steering lines and leaving it nearly unmaneuverable. Shortly after, another shot hit the command tower directly. Miguel Grau died instantly. Shocked, the crew came under Captain Elias Aguirre, who regained control of the monitor. He refused to surrender and chose to fight to the end, attempting to ram the Blanco Encalada. But the Chilean armored ship dodged in time and fired back, ending Aguirre's life. Command then fell to Lieutenant Pedro Guarinzon, who found the Huáscar with all its artillery disabled. The only option was to avoid its capture. He ordered the bottom valves open to sink the ship, but Chilean troops boarded in time, overpowered the exhausted crew, and stopped it. Of 200 crew members, 35 died in combat and 165 were captured. The Huáscar was towed to Valparaiso, where it would be repaired and incorporated into the Chilean fleet. Thus ended the Battle of Angamos, claiming Peru's last armored ship and its top commander, Rear Admiral Miguel Grau, who for months defended Peru with strategy, audacity, and a bravery worthy of true heroes. Chile honors Arturo Prat on May 21, while Peru observes a national holiday on October 80. Miguel Grau's heroism and legacy as the gentleman of the seas. If you want to learn more about his story told in this channel's unique style, I invite you to join and enjoy this exclusive members-only video. This way, you also help this project continue to grow. Subscribe if you haven't already and leave a like if you're enjoying this story. The naval campaign of the War of the Pacific ended on October 8, 1879, with the fall of the Monitor Huáscar. Following that outcome, the countries in conflict started preparing for the next stage, the land campaign. Over 20,000 Chilean soldiers would face roughly 14,000 Peruvians and 7,000 Bolivians. The Huáscar was no longer there to stop them. The Chilean plan was clear: to take Tarapacá. The southern region of Peru concentrated most of its saltpeter production. Conquering it would not only deal a heavy blow to the Peruvian economy, but also eliminate its main industrial competitor, the invasion. They chose the port of Pisagua, attacked its fort, and bombarded its coastal cannons. And so, boats full of soldiers began to penetrate its shores and defenses. Hand-to-hand combat broke out fiercely. The Allied resistance was tenacious, holding back the advance for hours. But finally, more than 10,500 Chilean soldiers managed to land, securing the first land victory. Chile suffered 68 casualties and 200 wounded. Boliviana lost 200 fighters and 70 were captured. Demoralization set in and many began to desert. Thus began the Tarapacá campaign. The next confrontation would come just 4 days later on November 6 in Pampa, Germania. There, 181 Chilean mounted hunters confronted 115 Junin hussars. Numerical superiority was decisive. The second Chilean victory was achieved in a bloody and relentless cavalry clash, where almost all the Allied defenders were cruelly eliminated. During those critical days, the Peruvian president, Mariano Ignacio Prado, met with the Bolivian Hilarion Daza and demanded that he be sent to the front immediately. The rest of his forces, which until then had been resting in Arica, they needed a numerical advantage if they wanted to change their fate. If the strategy he had in mind worked, there would still be hope for victory. Daza agreed, and his 4,000-strong army began a grueling desert march, eventually camping in the Quebrada de Camarones, about 90 kilometers from the Chilean positions. The plan was promising. The Bolivian forces would attack from the north, while the Peruvians would do so from the south, trapping the enemy in a pincer between two fronts of fire. However, on November 16, when everything was ready, President Daza suddenly decided to abandon the plan. He ordered his troops to retreat to Arica for its protection, claiming conditions were not optimal to continue. The southern Peruvian army was counting on his support, but they were betrayed, abandoned at a decisive moment. On November 19th, the Peruvian general Juan Buendía, unaware that Daza had withdrawn his forces, advanced into battle, confident that the Bolivians would arrive as agreed. But he was wrong. That was how the Battle of Dolores began. When the battle started, the Peruvians were horrified to realize the Bolivian army wouldn't arrive. The news caused shock among their ranks and great strategic confusion. The hopes for a victory had vanished. The Chileans, for their part, were already waiting for them from elevated positions on the hills to defend themselves with advantage and power. The Chilean victory was overwhelming. Forcing the Peruvian retreat toward the town of Tarapacá, Chile had once again captured the city of Iquique. 8 days later, on November 27, another decisive encounter took place, the Battle of Tarapacá. Chilean troops marched across the desert, intent on crushing the Peruvian resistance for good. But this time, they made a big mistake. They believed that Peru had only about 1,000 surviving soldiers left, when in reality, 4,500 would have held out. Chile's strategy was to attack Tarapacá from multiple fronts, unaware that the Peruvians were better prepared than expected. It was hours of intense and brutal combat where the Chilean army suffered heavy losses. 576 soldiers killed, 212 wounded, 66 taken prisoner, and the loss of 6 key pieces of modern artillery. That day, Colonel Andrés Avelino Cáceres emerged as the great hero of the day, leading his men with courage and boldness to victory. The young officers, Alfonso Ugarte and Roque Sáenz Peña, also distinguished themselves alongside him. However, despite the victory on the battlefield, the strategic situation did not change. The Peruvians, exhausted and without enough ammunition, could not hold the position for long. After the victory, General Buendía's army had to retreat through the mountains to Arica, leaving behind land won with blood but impossible to keep defending. Despite their losses, Chilean forces secured definitive control over Tarapacá. Would the city be theirs from then on? After the loss of the armored ship Independencia, the defeats at Angamos, Pizzagua, Germania, and Dolores. President Mariano Ignacio, now penniless, the one who had become very powerful, was left without money. He had the support of a family member of a murderous laundering. The Colombian government was left without a government. Colombians were left without Colombians who had become a great power. Money. The Colombian government, which had become a great power, was left without. And this had consequences. Accused of cowardice and treason, he was ousted by a military junta on December 2080. Days later, General Narciso Campero assumed the Bolivian presidency with the mission of restoring national dignity. Thus ended 1879, the year the War of the Pacific began, forever changing the fate of 3 nations. Many events unfolded quickly. On February 1st, Bolivia seized the assets of the Chilean Saltpeter Company. On February 14th, Chile occupied the port of Antofagasta, beginning the invasion. On March 1st, Bolivia declared war on Chile and confiscated the properties of Chilean citizens in its territory. The war's first armed clash, the Battle of Calema, occurred on March 23rd. Shortly after, on April 5th, Chile declared war on Peru, officially dragging it into the conflict. On May 21st, during the Battle of Iquique, Peru sank Arturo Prat's corvette Esmeralda, but lost Juan Guillermo Mori's frigate Independencia. Between May and September, the Huáscar raids took place under the command of Rear Admiral Miguel Grau, who boldly harassed the Chilean fleet, buying time for the Peruvian defense. However, on October 8th, the Huáscar was finally captured at the Battle of Angamos, and Grau fell in combat, marking the end of the naval conflict. On November 2nd, the land invasion began, with the landing and combat at the Battle of Dolores on the 19th and the Battle of Tarapacá on November 27th, thus sealing Chilean control over the entire province. The year ended with profound political changes and with the certainty that the conflict was far from over. A much bloodier and more decisive 1880 was approaching. Having consolidated its control over Tarapacá, Chile decided to focus its campaign on Tacna and Arica. The government ordered the occupation of the Peruvian coast, sending expeditions to Hilo, Moquegua, and Huyendo, which were taken without resistance. At the same time, the naval blockade was intensified, and the Monitor Huáscar reappeared in combat. Now, sailing under the Chilean flag, the Chileans looted the cities and destroyed the railway infrastructure, paralyzing Peruvian communications. But the turning point would come on March 22 with the Battle of Los Angeles, where the Atacama Battalion attacked the battalion. Vengadores de Grau entrenched on Cerro Los Angeles near Moquegua. It was a tough fight, but superior numbers decided the outcome, and the position fell. Chile took Moquegua, cutting off Peruvian communications to Tacna and Arica, thus marking the starting point of the final offensive. The Peruvian army withdrew to Tacna, intent on defending the city at any cost. Colonel Francisco Bolognesi was tasked with defending Arica, joined by Alfonso Ugarte, a young businessman who, with his own equipment, his battalion. On April 10th, the Chilean Navy began blockading Callao to further strangle the Peruvian economy and cut off Lima's resupply. Despite some successes like sinking the Loa and Covadonga, Chile established complete control of the sea and kept it until the war ended. On May 26th, 2 months after the Battle of Los Angeles, one of the bloodiest clashes of the EV Corps, known as the Battle of Alto de la Alianza. There, 14,000 Chilean soldiers backed by 37 cannons and 4 machine guns faced the Allied forces for the last time, who had 11,000 men and lighter weaponry. It was a fierce battle with hand-to-hand combat and executions. The field was strewn with death, as over 4,000 soldiers died and 5,000 were wounded. On both sides, Chile prevailed once again. La Paz fell, and with that, Bolivia decided to withdraw from the conflict for good, marking the end of the alliance. Peru was left alone. The bad news reached Arica. The arrival of the Chilean army was imminent. Despite knowing what was coming, Colonel Francisco Bolognesi made a decision that would be recorded in history. He refused to retreat and would fight to the end. He organized his 1,600 men into defensive batteries on the beach and atop Morro de Arica. More than 6,000 Chilean soldiers were advancing toward them. The disparity was overwhelming. There was no doubt victory would go to Chile. Then, General Manuel Baquedano, leading the offensive, decided to send an emissary, a sergeant carrying a message requesting Bolognesi's surrender. Seeking to avoid a massive and inevitable bloodshed, Bolognesi's response would be forceful and eternal. On June 6th, Chile began an intense naval and land bombardment of Arica, which lasted for hours. Peru bravely resisted from the sea, defended by the monitor Manco Capac. But in the early morning of June 7th, the Chilean forces managed to simultaneously capture the coastal batteries. Then hand-to-hand combat erupted, and the final advance began, steadily assaulting the hill. Dozens of stories about honor and courage were written in minutes, like that of the young volunteer gunner, just 16 years old, who, to prevent the Peruvian cannons from being captured, deliberately set fire to the powder magazine of his battery, causing an explosion that ended his life. Along with many Chilean soldiers' lives, the numerical superiority became evident. The Chilean troops advanced up to the hill, cornering the enemy, and after overcoming all their defenses and positions, Francisco Bolognesi was hit by a shot. Mortally wounded, he fought with his revolver until a rifle butt fractured his skull, killing him. Many historical accounts, including Jorge Basadre's, support this. Alfonso Ugarte was among the last to resist. Clutching the Peruvian flag, he rode his horse off the hilltop into the abyss, heading toward that fate rather than surrender, rather than allow the flag to fall into enemy hands. Some accounts say he was killed in combat. Others claim he accidentally fell after being mortally wounded. The truth is divided. What is undeniable is that Alfonso Ugarte, unlike the others, had no formal obligation to be there. He was a young businessman of 32, heir to saltpeter and mining companies. He had a business trip to Europe and was about to get married, but postponed everything to stay. He used his fortune to assemble a battalion and decided to fight to the end for what he loved most, Peru. But despite his courage and sacrifice, Alfonso Ugarte was never officially recognized as a national hero. I have no doubt he was one. He wasn't a soldier or had any official duty, but his love for his country was so genuine that he chose to give his life to defend it. That's why, among all the heroes, Alfonso Ugarte is my favorite. Comment if you would like to know his full story or the stories of other heroes from the War of the Pacific on this channel. And if you're enjoying the video, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. It's the best way to support the channel and encourage new stories that also deserve to be told. After the fall of Arica, Peru lost its professional army and most of its experienced officers. Despite the economic collapse from the war and naval blockade, the hero of the homeland, officially recognized as a hero, the governor said that the thought... Enterprises, Arantha, you can consult. If you have time for Arantha's Enterprises, Monto de Spain, Las VLG Driat, and Bear, happy that you arrived. Women also participated by making uniforms and supporting the soldiers in the field. The entire Peruvian people mobilized. Even upper-class citizens made voluntary contributions to finance the defense. Patriotic fervor turned the resistance into a national crusade. President Piarola took command of the military strategy despite having no military training and ignored the advice of his general staff, including those of experienced leaders like Colonel Andres Abelino Cáceres, who warned that the attack would come from the south, but Piarola insisted that the enemy would arrive from the north. And he had reasons to think so, since during those months between September and October of 1880, Chile approved an expedition of looting and punishment, proposed and led by General Patricio Lynch, commanding 2,200 soldiers, who advanced along the northern coast of Peru, demanding forced contributions, war quotas, and extortion under threats of looting and destruction. Lynch imposed these conditions on the ports, towns, and estates of Paita, Iten, Chiclayo, Fereñafe, Lambayeque, Supe, Chimbote, and other cities, causing severe economic damage. Along the way that, along with the collection of funds, were their main objectives. While that was happening, on October 22, a final diplomatic attempt at peace took place, known as the Arica Conference, mediated by the United States. In it, delegates from Chile, Peru, and Bolivia met aboard the American ship La Cajuana, anchored off Arica. Chile demanded, as a condition for peace, the permanent cession of Antofagasta and Tarapacá, and the occupation of Arica, Tacna, and Moquegua, an indemnity of 20 million gold pesos, and the return of all confiscated ships. Peru called the proposal unacceptable and humiliating. The talks broke down without agreements, with both sides accusing each other of using negotiations to gain military time. There was no deal. Following that failure, the Chilean government concluded that only occupying Lima would make Peru surrender. The Lima campaign was about to begin, and for it, the Chilean government decided to double its army and equip it with modern artillery. Their standout weapons included Belgian Comblain rifles, French Gras rifles, Winchester carbines, powerful German Krupp cannons, and feared Nordenfeldt machine guns. War logistics were strengthened by assigning over 1,200 mules for transport. The Chilean army landed without resistance in Paracas, demanding the surrender of Pisco, which was defended by Colonel Manuel Zamudio, who withdrew with his troops in the face of the enemy advance. Chile occupied Pisco, and on November 23 took Ica, along with the towns of Chincha Alta, Chincha Baja, and Tambo de Mora. Just as Andrés Avelino Cáceres had warned, the Chilean army approached from the south. President Pierola hurried to two defensive lines. The first extended from San Juan de Miraflores to Monterrico, covering 14 kilometers of front, designed to withstand the first assault. The second line would be set up near the Miraflores resort, with 6 kilometers of defense. However, the design had major tactical flaws, including overly long lines and insufficient defensive depth, and a separation of 10 kilometers between both positions, making it difficult to concentrate forces and communicate. Even so, despite that, everything seemed to be ready. That's how 1880 ended, a year in which Chile focused its offensive on Tacna and Arica. On March 22 at the Battle of Los Angeles, Chile took Moquegua, severing Peruvian communications to the south. On April 10, the Chilean Navy blockaded Callao, crippling Peru's economy and isolating its capital. On May 26, after the bloody Battle of Tacna, Bolivia withdrew from the conflict, ending the alliance. On June 7, at the Battle of Arica, Peru lost its professional army and bravest commanders. On September 4, Patricio Lynch's expedition began looting cities and towns along the Peruvian coast. On October 22, a last diplomatic effort for peace failed to reach an agreement. On November 19, the Chilean army occupied Pisco, and on the 23rd took Ica. Both sides ended that year, preparing for the final confrontation, the Lima campaign. This begins with the Battle of San Juan and Chorrillos, South America's largest confrontation involving almost 50,000 combatants on both sides. The battle started at dawn on January 13, 1881. The three Chilean divisions attacked the first Peruvian defensive line from San Juan, Santa Teresa, and Morro Solar, targeting its weakest points. Then, to encircle and destroy the enemy army, Peru resisted with everything it had, but it was outnumbered and outgunned. Even so, it tried to take advantage of its fortified lines to wear down the enemy. By midday, after intense clashes that left thousands of soldiers dead, the Chileans managed to break through the first line. It began to give way on several flanks after intense hand-to-hand fighting in the trenches. The Peruvian army was forced to retreat in the midst of a desolate scene. Then, Chile launched its cavalry against the retreating troops, starting a bloody pursuit. They attacked Morro Solar and pressed on until they took it. Of the 5,000 Peruvians defending it, just 280 survived. After that confrontation, the Chilean troops took the resort of Chorrillos, sealing the end of the most ruthless battle of the entire war. The outcome was devastating. More than 10,000 soldiers dead, 7,000 Peruvians, and 3,000 Chileans, as well as 6,000 wounded, and nearly 3,000 prisoners. The situation in Chorrillos, Barranco, and the surrounding areas was desolate. They burned in flames as the landscape became a grim scene of ruin and death. General Baquedano ordered Barranco to be burned to the ground, convinced that Peruvian snipers were hiding there. The following hours were filled with widespread looting and assaults committed by a drunken Chilean army, out of control after their victory. During the chaos, Colonel Andrés Avelino Cáceres suggested a surprise night counterattack with the 5,000 men, who the Chilean troops were scattered and distracted. Maybe there was an opportunity? However, Piarola did not authorize this operation, judging it to be too risky. Caceres would later regret not taking advantage of this unique opportunity, since just 2 days later, on January 15, 1881, the Battle of Miraflores would begin. After another failed attempt at surrender by Chile, Piarola refused to capitulate without a fight, still having a second defensive line. It was made up of reserve battalions consisting of civilians between 11,000 and 14,000 armed men with only 19 cannons and 8 machine guns. The Chilean army was also suffering after the last battle, with many of its 13,000 soldiers exhausted or wounded. So both sides agreed to a truce until midnight on January 15th. But the peace didn't last long. A stray shot during the advance of Chilean troops suddenly triggered unexpected crossfire, the Battle of Miraflores. Fighting erupted along the entire second defensive line as Caceres launched a bold counterattack that nearly broke through the Chilean lines. The invading troops retreated. Witnesses from both sides claimed that if the reserve battalions had come to reinforce Caceres' attack, they could have annihilated a significant part of the Chilean division, but the reinforcements never came. Without clear orders, the reservists remained motionless, while the Chilean squad, better organized and communicated, managed to recover and regain numerical superiority. On the battlefield, Caceres resisted to the limit. Meanwhile, Nicolás del Piarola, overcome by panic, ordered the dissolution of what was left of the army and the dispersal of the troops. And at 5 in the afternoon, he left the battlefield, escorted by his personal guard, fleeing to the mountains at the most critical moment of the confrontation. Despite the collapse, the Peruvian commanders continued the fight in the turmoil. But the Chilean superiority was overwhelming. There was no way to contain it. At 5:30, a second assault caused the redoubts to fall one by one. Around 7 in the evening, the battle continued inside the town of Miraflores, whose houses, mostly made of light materials, became easy prey for the flames. The Chilean troops entered, fighting street by street, under a darkness barely broken by the glow of the fires. The resort turned into a motionless hell. Miraflores was finally completely taken at 9 o'clock at night, just like in Carrillos. The victorious troops looted the area, with reports of wounded Peruvians shot and prisoners executed. That ended organized resistance in the capital. Lima fell and would be militarily occupied by Chile for the following years, until 1883. The Peruvian army had been defeated, but the war did not end there. In April of that same year, the first Chilean expeditions to the Central Highlands began, sparking 6 battles between April and October of 1881. Brutal abuses against civilians during these campaigns fueled deep hatred of the Chilean occupation and sparked the rise of Peruvian guerrillas in the Andes. The popular resistance had begun. In July 1881, a council of Peruvian aristocrats met with Chilean authorities, and together with the president of Peru, Garcia. However, Garcia Calderon also firmly refused to give up Peruvian territory, as Chile demanded for peace. Faced with this refusal, in November, he was dragged and deported as a prisoner to Chile, unleashing a new stage of the conflict, the guerrilla war. The Bring Your Sierra campaign started with a major Chilean offensive in Peru's central highlands. From February to July, 1,882 13 battles occurred, mostly in Junín, but also in Ayacucho, Cerro de Pasco, and Cajamarca. In these, Colonel Caceres offered admirable resistance and triumphed in several key engagements, especially those at Pucará, Concepción, and Marcaval, where his forces, supported by local guerrillas, managed to contain and punish the Chilean army. By July of 1882, Chile was forced to withdraw from the Central Highlands with a wounded army, and battered by an unforgiving geography, diseases, and the actions of the fierce army of Andrés Avelino Cáceres, who managed to free the Department of Junín and established himself as the undisputed leader of the Peruvian resistance, a symbol of a country that, despite everything, refused to surrender. However, just a month later, in August 1882, General Miguel Iglesias, former Minister of War under Nicolás del Pierola, made a public proclamation from his estate, Montan, in Cajamarca. This event would become known as the Cry of Montan. In his manifesto, Iglesias warned that prolonging the resistance would only bring more ruin and more suffering. It was a sterile, useless, unforgivable loss. Peru had to seek peace even at the cost of giving up territory. Iglesias proclaimed himself Supreme Chief of Peru in the Free Departments of the North and began talks with the Chileans. This deepened the division among Peruvians. On one side, there were the Chile supporters who favored a peace agreement, and on the other, the Cáceres supporters, who considered any territorial concession as a betrayal. Finally, the Chileans recognized Iglesias as Peru's regenerator president, and to secure peace, ordered Cáceres, still active in the Highlands, to be neutralized. Thus, the Battle of Huamachuco was fought in July 1883, where Cáceres was defeated and lost his entire army, marking the end of the Peruvian resistance. On October 20, 1883, Miguel Iglesias signed the Treaty of Ancón, through which Peru definitively ceded Tarapacá. Meanwhile, Tacna and Arica stayed under Chilean control for a decade, at the end of which a sovereignty plebiscite was supposed to be held, but this plebiscite was never carried out. 46 years later, through the Treaty of Lima in 1929, Tacna returned to Peru, while Arica remained definitively in the hands of Chile. In addition to the territorial cession, Peru was also forced to pay indemnities and to recognize the legal and judicial validity of all acts carried out by Chile during its occupation. It was a treaty that generated deep controversy due to the abusive nature of its conditions and the national pain it left behind. On October 29, 1883, Chile occupied Arequipa, the final stronghold after the treaty was signed. The Peruvian army ended up dissolving. The War of the Pacific was over. In December, Chile began withdrawing its troops and the Peruvian public administration started to rebuild. Courts reopened, the municipality of Lima resumed operations, and basic services and tax collection were restored. Miguel Iglesias assumed the provisional presidency, but he was unable to unify the country. His government lacked popular support, and many sectors considered him illegitimate for having signed peace under humiliating conditions. This quickly led to a new internal conflict. General Andrés Abelino Cáceres, considered a national hero for his resistance, refused to recognize Iglesias' leadership, whom he saw as an enemy of national dignity. Thus began the Civil War of 1884 and 1885, a struggle among Peruvians that ended with the fall of Iglesias and the rise of Cáceres to the presidency, marking the beginning of the difficult process of national reconstruction. Well, that's another story. This was the War of the Pacific, a war that for Chile meant consolidating itself as a regional power, expanding its territory and influence. For Peru, it was a devastating blow that caused a social, political, and moral crisis. Those wounds would take decades to heal. It was an unnecessary foreign war, caused by secret pacts and leaders lacking national vision. Manuel González Prada stated it bluntly. The real enemy was internal, a ruling class unable to reform and a people excluded from their homeland. And the truth is that during the war, there was never a truly united nation. This makes sense as the indigenous population was legally excluded from the country they were asked to defend during those years. They had no political rights or national representation, lived under servitude without property or access to education, without a voice or a vote, without a face or expression. Peru at that time was a nation of urban Creole elites that completely ignored the role of the indigenous people in national identity. The writer Ricardo Palma said it bluntly: the main cause of the defeat was that the majority of Peru was made up of a degraded race, The indigenous people lacked patriotic feeling and made up 70% of the military force. They were treated as servants, not as citizens, he concluded. The War of the Pacific was fragmented, a reflection of inequality, neglect, and internal division. But at the same time, it was the stage where stories of courage and sacrifice were forged, stories that still live on in the memory of a country that knew how to resist, even when everything seemed lost. A war left a silent call to build a fairer, more united and humane country. That's why their traces remain in the streets, in their names, in the memory of the people who fought, and in everyone. Lessons and reflections were left floating in the air after the War of the Pacific. I would love to read your opinion in the comments. If you like this video, don't forget to leave a like and share it with those who appreciate it. To know a past that in many ways still lives within us. See you in the next story. Goodbye.